In a windowless room outside Tokyo in March of 1944, Japanese naval intelligence officers listened to sounds they could not understand. The war had entered its third year, and by now Japan's cryptographers had broken nearly every Allied system they encountered. Diplomatic cables, naval signals, army traffic, all had eventually yielded to patience and method. Yet this transmission was different. The voices coming through the receivers were neither random nor chaotic. They followed disciplined timing. They rose and fell with intention. They appeared moments before American attacks and ceased when objectives were taken. This was not noise. It was language, and it was impenetrable. Commander Atsuzo Kurihara, one of Japan's most experienced signals officers, studied the transcripts piling up on his desk. The Ada Communications Unit was among the most advanced intelligence facilities in the world, staffed by hundreds of analysts trained in linguistics, mathematics, and cryptography. They had cracked the American diplomatic purple system before Pearl Harbor. They had penetrated British naval traffic. Yet this signal defeated them completely. No substitution patterns emerged. No repetitions aligned. No statistical foothold presented itself after 18 hours of continuous work. Kurihara reached an unthinkable conclusion. This was not a cipher they failed to solve. This was something they did not even know how to begin attacking. What Kurihara could not know was that the solution to his mystery had been forged thousands of miles away, far from the laboratories of Tokyo and the battlefields of the Pacific. It had been shaped over centuries by a people whose language had never been written to be decoded, never designed for machines, and never studied by foreign powers. The key to the only unbroken military code in modern history lay in the American Southwest, in a language the United States government itself had once tried to erase. Long before it became a weapon of war, Navajo was a living system shaped by land, ritual, and survival. It was a language built around action rather than objects, where verbs carried the weight of meaning and subtle shifts in tone could transform intent entirely. Spoken Navajo relied on sounds unfamiliar to most of the world: explosive consonants, breathy fricatives, glottal stops that changed meaning with the slightest misplacement of air. Even fluent speakers of European or Asian languages struggled to hear these distinctions, let alone reproduce them accurately. To outsiders, Navajo speech often sounded fluid yet fragmented, patterned yet elusive. To linguists, it was among the most complex languages on Earth. In the early 20th century, this complexity was not celebrated. Navajo children were sent to boarding schools where speaking their language was forbidden, punished, and ridiculed. English was enforced as the path to citizenship and progress. Navajo was labeled backward, an obstacle to assimilation. By the 1930s, an entire generation had been taught that their native tongue was something to hide. Few could have imagined that within a decade, that same language would become one of America's most decisive strategic advantages. The man who first recognized this possibility was Philip Johnston. Born on the Navajo reservation to missionary parents, Johnston grew up immersed in Navajo life. By childhood, he spoke the language fluently, translating sermons and conversations with ease. He understood its rhythms, its metaphors, and its internal logic in ways almost no outsider did. When the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, Johnston saw a pattern others missed. He read reports about Native American soldiers being used informally as communicators in training exercises. These efforts were improvised, limited, and unsystematic. But Johnston saw something larger. He believed Navajo could be transformed into a formal military code, fast, secure, and beyond the reach of enemy cryptography. In February 1942, Johnston presented his idea to Marine Corps leadership in Southern California. Skepticism was immediate. Military planners trusted machines, encryption tables, and standardized procedures. A spoken language, especially one unfamiliar to most Americans, seemed unreliable. Johnston insisted on a demonstration. 4 Navajo men transmitted a mock tactical message using their language, while Marine officers timed the results. The outcome stunned everyone present. What took traditional cipher machines half an hour to encode, transmit, decode, and relay was completed in seconds. The message was accurate, instantaneous, and required no written materials. The generals did not fully understand what they had witnessed, but they understood its implications. The Marine Corps approved a trial program immediately. That spring, 29 Navajo recruits were brought to Camp Elliott and sworn into service. They came from across the reservation, some educated in government schools, others raised as shepherds, with little exposure to the outside world. Many had been punished as children for speaking the very language the Marines now demanded they master perfectly. Inside a guarded building, under strict secrecy, they began an unprecedented task. They were not simply translating English into Navajo, they were creating a code within a language, one that could survive the chaos of battle. There were no Navajo words for tanks, submarines, machine guns, or dive bombers. The recruits built meaning through metaphor and cultural logic. A submarine became an iron fish. A battleship became a whale. Fighter planes were hummingbirds, bombers buzzards circling overhead. These choices were not poetic decoration. They were functional memory tools, intuitive to Navajo speakers yet meaningless to anyone else. The alphabet posed a greater challenge. To prevent frequency analysis, each English letter was assigned multiple Navajo words. Common letters had several alternatives, forcing speakers to vary usage constantly. No patterns could form, no repetitions could be counted. The code existed only in memory. No books were allowed. Capture could not compromise it. Training was relentless. The recruits memorized every term until recall became instinct. Errors were unacceptable. In combat, a single mistake could redirect artillery onto friendly forces or delay support long enough to cost lives. For many of the men, the responsibility carried spiritual weight. In Navajo belief, words possess power. To speak incorrectly was not just a technical failure, but a moral one. The first real test came in August 1942, when Navajo code talkers landed with the Marine invasion force on Guadalcanal. Japanese intelligence had anticipated the operation, having decoded other Allied communications. But as the fighting began, their advantage vanished. Marine tactical traffic suddenly became incomprehensible. Signals officers recorded transmission after transmission, certain they were hearing structured language yet unable to identify its origin or meaning. Attacks came without warning. Artillery strikes landed with precision. Countermeasures failed before they could be organized. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese commanders were blind. At intelligence headquarters in Rabaul, analysts worked around the clock, convinced that a breakthrough was possible. They believed every code could be broken with enough data. But Navajo was not a cipher constructed from mathematics. It was a living language layered with metaphor, tone, and cultural reference. Even identifying where one word ended and another began proved difficult. The very features that made Navajo unsuitable for machines made it devastatingly effective against them. By the end of 1942, it was clear that something unprecedented had entered the war. Japanese intelligence officers reported that American Marine communications had become a closed system, immune to analysis. The recordings piled up. The frustration grew, and the men who spoke the code continued working under fire, unaware that across the ocean, some of the world's finest cryptographers were listening helplessly to every word. The unbroken code had begun its work. As the Pacific War intensified, Japanese intelligence refused to accept defeat. Codes, by doctrine and experience, were systems meant to yield. No matter how complex, they believed structure implied vulnerability. The mysterious marine transmissions violated that belief. They sounded human, yet resisted every known method of linguistic or cryptographic attack. Analysts catalogued hours of intercepted speech, slowing recordings, isolating syllables, mapping pitch and duration. Patterns emerged in timing and message length, but not in meaning. The signals arrived, action followed, and then silence. Cause and effect without comprehension. In late 1942, Japanese intelligence pursued what seemed like their last viable lead. Earlier that year, during the fall of Bataan, a Native American soldier had been captured alive. Joe Kiyomiya was Navajo by birth and spoke the language fluently. If anyone could unlock the mystery, it would be him. He was transferred to an interrogation center where Japanese officers believed they finally held the key to the American secret system. They played him recordings of intercepted transmissions. To Japanese ears, these messages were alien. To Kiyomiya, there was something stranger still. He recognized individual Navajo words, but they were arranged in ways that made no sense. The turtle attacks the iron fish. The hummingbird carries eggs. The buzzard circles. The words were familiar, the meaning was not. Kiyomiya explained repeatedly that while he spoke Navajo, he had never encountered these expressions used this way. He could not translate what he did not understand. His interrogators did not accept this answer. From their perspective, the prisoner was either withholding information or resisting under orders. The pressure escalated. Over months, Kiyomiya endured systematic torture designed to break his resolve. He was beaten, deprived of food, subjected to water torture, suspended by his arms until his shoulders dislocated. During winter, he was forced to stand naked in the snow until his feet froze to the ground. At his weakest, starving and barely conscious, interrogators offered food in exchange for explanations he could not give. Japanese intelligence documented the failure with growing unease. The prisoner was unquestionably native to the language being intercepted, yet he could not interpret its military meaning. Analysts debated the implications. Either the Americans had trained speakers in a specialized system beyond ordinary language use, or this represented an unprecedented form of encryption embedded within speech itself. The second conclusion was more troubling. It meant fluency alone was insufficient. Understanding required initiation. By mid-1943, Japanese intelligence quietly scaled back its efforts to break the code. Resources were redirected to other priorities. Orders were issued to capture Marine communicators alive if possible, but battlefield realities made this nearly impossible. Code talkers worked in pairs, guarded closely, often under direct fire. Equipment was destroyed if capture seemed imminent. Not a single Navajo code talker was taken with operational materials intact. While Japanese analysts reached the limits of their understanding, the Marine Corps expanded the program rapidly. Success on Guadalcanal convinced commanders that Navajo communicators were not a novelty, but a strategic necessity. Training pipelines were formalized. New recruits arrived every 8 weeks, subjected to a regimen unlike any other in the Corps. They memorized an ever-expanding vocabulary, practiced under simulated combat noise, transmitted while running, exhausted or wearing gas masks. Accuracy was enforced with absolute discipline. The code itself evolved alongside the war. New weapons, tactics, and technologies demanded new terminology. Each edition followed the same internal logic grounded in Navajo cultural metaphor. An atomic bomb became a metal egg. Kamikaze aircraft were deathwind. These terms were intuitive to trained speakers, yet meaningless to anyone else. The language's agglutinative structure allowed complex concepts to be compressed into brief transmissions. What required paragraphs in English could be conveyed in seconds. On the battlefield, the effect was transformative. At Tarawa, in November 1943, 6 code talkers maintained communications through 76 hours of nearly continuous combat. Shellfire severed wires, radios were destroyed, and command posts were overrun. Yet messages continued to flow. Navajo communicators relayed artillery coordinates, casualty reports, and resupply requests without interruption. Japanese forces, accustomed to intercepting and anticipating Allied movements, found themselves reacting too late or not at all. At Saipan and Tinian, the pattern repeated. Japanese commanders had successfully decoded conventional signals before the landings, giving them advance warning. Once Marines hit the beaches, that intelligence vanished. Tactical decisions had to be made without insight into American intentions. Counterattacks faltered. Defensive positions were isolated and destroyed piecemeal. One Japanese officer later wrote that the sudden silence felt like fighting an enemy without a shadow. The code talker's value was not only in security, but speed. An artillery request transmitted in Navajo took seconds to send and seconds to act upon. Conventional encryption required encoding, relay, decoding, verification, and retransmission. In close combat, that delay could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Navajo communicators collapsed time itself, compressing decision-making into moments. On Peleliu, during a brutal Japanese counterattack, one code talker continued transmitting for hours, After his partner was killed beside him, under direct fire, he coordinated artillery from multiple battalions, sending dozens of messages without error. The battle was among the bloodiest of the war. Commanders later acknowledged that without secure, rapid communication, the outcome might have been catastrophic. Japanese intelligence did not stop listening. They recorded everything, hoping for a miracle. Specialized equipment was developed to analyze pitch and tone without distortion. Scholars were consulted, including linguists and religious figures familiar with ancient languages. Oscilloscopes traced sound waves visually, searching for repetition where ears failed. They identified probable call signs and correlations between message length and operation size. But without meaning, these insights offered little advantage. Knowing that a long message preceded a major action did not reveal where or how it would occur. By late 1943, the Imperial Navy formally acknowledged the failure. Reports noted that the Americans had adopted a communication system immune to interception, one that could not be reduced to numbers or symbols. It was a human system protected by culture itself. The conclusion unsettled senior officers. They had prepared for American industry, machinery, and firepower. They had not prepared for something so simple, so elegant, and so completely outside their analytical frameworks. As the war pushed towards Japan's inner defensive perimeter, the Navajo Code traveled with it. From island to island, across jungles, reefs, and volcanic rock, the voices of young men once punished for speaking their language now directed the most powerful military operations in history. And the enemy continued to listen, unable to understand a single word that mattered. The ultimate test of the Navajo Code came in February 1945 on a small volcanic island whose name would become synonymous with sacrifice. Iwo Jima was barely 8 square miles of black sand and rock, but it had been transformed into a fortress. Beneath its surface stretched miles of tunnels, bunkers, and artillery positions carved into the stone. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the island's commander, had spent 2 years preparing a defense designed to bleed the American invasion force dry. Central to his plan was intelligence. Previous campaigns had shown that intercepted American communications often revealed intentions before assaults began. Kuribayashi believed he could counterattack at moments of maximum vulnerability, turning the island into a killing ground. That plan unraveled the moment the first Marines landed. From the opening minutes of the assault, Navajo code talkers controlled the flow of the battle. 6 men working in pairs formed the nerve center of the invasion's communications. They transmitted orders, coordinates, and reports continuously, often while shells exploded around them and sniper fire swept the beaches. Radios were damaged, replaced, repaired, and carried forward again. The code never faltered. Over the first 48 hours, more than 800 messages passed through Navajo hands without a single error. They coordinated naval gunfire from over 100 ships offshore. They directed close air support onto hidden gun emplacements. They relayed casualty figures, ammunition requests, and shifting unit positions as the Marines fought yard by yard across the island. Artillery strikes requested in seconds destroyed Japanese positions that might otherwise have held for hours. Kuribayashi's carefully timed counterattacks failed to materialize, not because of lack of courage or preparation, but because he could not see when or where to strike. Japanese intelligence officers listening from afar knew something was terribly wrong. They intercepted the transmissions as always, but meaning remained locked away. The island's defenders waited for intelligence that never came. By the time American movements became visible, it was already too late to respond effectively. One officer later wrote that it felt as though the enemy spoke in a voice that reached everywhere at once, while their own commanders shouted into darkness. After the battle, American officers were blunt in their assessment. The invasion had depended on communication at a scale never before attempted. Tens of thousands of Marines, hundreds of ships, and constant air support had to move as a single organism. That coordination flowed through Navajo code. One officer testified that without the code talkers, the Marines would not have taken the island. The statement was not rhetorical. It was operational fact. The war's final campaigns only reinforced this conclusion. At Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific, more than 30 Navajo code talkers operated across the battlefield for nearly 3 months. Japanese forces attempted jamming and deception, even assigning personnel to mimic what they believed the mysterious language might sound like. Navajo's tonal complexity and unfamiliar phonetics made imitation impossible. To trained ears, the attempts sounded absurd. On August 14, 1945, as Japan prepared to surrender, a Navajo code talker transmitted the final message of the war through the system that had never been broken. The words passed through Navajo before reaching conventional channels, a quiet confirmation of how deeply the code had become embedded in Marine operations. The unbroken code had carried the war from its darkest days to its end, yet victory did not bring immediate recognition. The entire program remained classified. Code talkers returned home, unable to speak of their service, even to family. Many came back to communities where they still faced discrimination, denied basic rights and services. The language that had helped win the war was still viewed by some as inferior. For years, their contribution existed only in silence. When the program was finally declassified decades later, the scale of what had been achieved stunned historians. Japanese records revealed the depth of their efforts and the completeness of their failure. Senior intelligence officials admitted they had never come close to understanding Marine communications. They had broken nearly everything else, but not this, not once. Recognition came slowly. Reunions, ceremonies, and eventually national honors acknowledged the men who had carried their language into battle. For many, the healing came not from medals, but from seeing Navajo spoken openly again, taught with pride rather than shame. The code talkers had modernized their language under fire, proving it could adapt to anything from ceremony to combat. Their legacy reaches beyond World War II. They demonstrated that security does not always come from complexity in machines, but from complexity in people. Long before discussions of cultural diversity became doctrine, Navajo code talkers embodied its power. A nation that once tried to silence their voices had relied on those voices to survive. Japanese intelligence officers who failed to break the code understood its significance best. They had prepared for American industry, firepower, and technology. They had not prepared for American diversity. They faced an enemy whose strength came from sources they could not access, measure, or replicate. The Navajo code was never broken because it was never just a code. It was a living culture turned into strategy, a language shaped by centuries of experience pressed into the service of survival. Its greatest message was not carried in any single transmission, but in what it proved. Differences are not weaknesses, they are strengths, and sometimes they are unbreakable.